Hello, hello. I'm Tom Smith. I'm going to be reading this story called Paul Bunyan's Cornstalk. So let's get to it. Paul Bunyan was the fellow who invented the axe with two edges, so a man could stand between two trees and chop them both down at the same time. As it turned out, Paul was the only man who could do that trick, but the other lumberjacks used the double biting axe. Yeah, double bitted axe. Anyway, because they didn't have to sharpen the blade so often. Paul Bunyan also had other tricks. Most lumberjacks used to cut off the tops of the pines before they felled them, but when Paul was in a hurry, he'd wait till a tree started falling, then he'd set with his axe and lop off the top of the tree as it came down. Nothing Paul Bunyan ever did was small. He had an ox named Babe, who used to help him with his logging work. Babe was just about the most phenomenal ox in Michigan. His color was blue, and he stood 90 hands high. If you happened to hang on the tip of one horn, it's doubtful if you could have seen the tip of the other. Even on a clear day, one day when Paul and Babe out plowing, the ox was strung by a Michigan deer fly about the size of a bushel basket. Babe took off across the country, dragging the plow behind him right across Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and with the deer fly bringing up the rear. After a while, Babe veered south and didn't stop till he got into the Rio Grande. The plow that Babe was hitched to dug a furrow 4 miles wide, 200 miles long. You can check it in your own geography book. They call it the Grand Canyon nowadays. Even the storms that was in were big. The biggest of all was the one that they call the Big Blue Snow. It snowed for 2 months straight, and the way the drifts piled up, only the tops of the tallest pines were showing. Lumberjacks went out that winter on their snowshoes and cut off all the pine tops. It saved them a lot of time when spring came around. Babe, the blue ox, didn't get a wink of sleep, though from December till the first of March it seems that standing out there in the weather the way he was, the snow that fell on his back melted and ran down his tail, and once it got there it froze into ice. Babe's tail kept getting heavier and heavier, and it drew on his hide so hard it just pulled his eyelids wide open and kept them that way. Babe never did get his eyes closed until the spring thaw came and melted the ice off his tail. But the big blue snow wasn't anything compared to the big drought that started in Saginaw country and spread out as far as the Alleghenies in the east and the Rockies in the west. It all started with Paul Bunyan's vegetable garden. Paul planted some corn and some pumpkins. One of those corn stalks was 6 feet high before the others had sprouted. In 2 weeks it was tall as a house and growing like crazy. About the time it was as big as 50-year-old pine. People began to come in from all over the country to see it. It was growing out of the ground so fast it was pulling up stones that even the frost couldn't heave out. Some kind of thing more or less happened to one of the pumpkin vines. It grew so fast it just darted around like a Masaziga rattlesnake. It climbed into any place where there was an opening. People had to keep their windows closed. The ones that didn't had to cut their way out of their beds with a bush knife. Sometimes that vine would grow into one window and out another between sunset and sunrise. Things weren't too bad until the vine blossomed and the pumpkins came out. They were about the size of hogshead, the little pumpkins, that is. And when the vine whipped back and forth looking for some place to grow, it just snapped the pumpkins round like crab apples on a string. People had to be mighty alert to keep from getting hit by those pumpkins. One man lost a team of horses that way and half a dozen good barns and one silo were stoved in. But the real problem started when the corn and pumpkin roots began to soak up all the water out of the ground. Farms for 60 miles around went dry, fields, springs, and wells. The pine woods turned yellow from the lack of moisture, and the Au Sable River just turned into a trickle. And pretty soon there wasn't anything there but dry mud. The next thing that happened was that the water in the Great Lakes began to go down. It went down so fast in Lake Huron it left the fish hanging in the air. When the things began to look real bad, folks came and told Paul Bunyan he'd just have to get rid of his corn and pumpkins. Paul was reasonable about it. First he went after the pumpkin vines. He spent 4 hours racing around trying to catch hold of hold of the end, and finally did it by trapping it in the barn. He hitched Babe up to the end of the vine, but as fast as Babe pulled, the vine grew. Babe ran faster and faster, and he was near Lake Ontario before he had the vine tight enough to pull it out. Then Paul sized up his cornstalk. He figured he'd have to chop it down. He sharpened up his axe and spit on his hand. He made a good deep cut in the stalk, but before he could chip out a wedge. The stalk grew up 6 feet, cut and all. Every time he made a cut, it would shoot up out of reach before he could swing his axe again. Pretty soon he saw there wasn't any use going on this way. Only way to kill this stalk is to cut off the top, he said. He hung his axe in his belt and started climbing. In about 2 hours he was completely out of sight. People just stood around and waited. They stood around 2.5 days without any sight of Paul. Lars Larson called Paul, but there was no answer. Eric Erickson and Hans Handsome called Paul, but there wasn't any word from Paul Bunyan. So they waited some more. 2 more days went by, no word from Paul. They decided that if everyone yelled at once, maybe the sound would carry. So altogether, the 2,800 men and boys hollered, "Paul!" And sure enough, they heard his faint voice from up above. "When you gonna top that cornstalk?" they yelled back at him. "Hasn't the top come down yet?" Paul hollered back. "I cut it off 3 days ago." It was the truth, too. The stalk stopped growing, the water in the Great Lakes stopped falling, and all Sable River began to run. The spring began to flow again, and things came back to normal. But it was a narrow escape. All right. Later. Bye. So, yeah, I'm going to go.